So fumigation is the use of smoke or fumes or vapor in a ritual context. It literally means sending smoke up from below. And as it turns out, it's one of the most widespread practices among spiritual practitioners worldwide and throughout history. Why is it such a popular practice, and how can you make use of scented smoke in your own rituals? That's what we're going to look into today. There are quite a few theories on why fumigation is such an effective part of any given ritual, why it plays such a potent, important role in so many practices. And of course, it would be very hard to say that one theory is more accurate than another in the absence of a definitive theory of how the world works. But I think it might be fun to go over a few of those theories. Maybe you'll find something that resonates with you and your practice, and maybe you'll find something that sounds absolutely preposterous, that you feel you might have outgrown, or that you might eventually grow into, or back into. After all, a healthy philosophy of life should always come with the understanding that philosophies are maps, and of course maps are only ever useful insofar as they're not confused for the territory itself. So here we go, a few interesting theories of why fumigation works so well according to different maps, before we dive into the second part about how you can use fumigation yourself. Let's start with a very basic, realist worldview that accepts that spirits are individual entities, quite distinct from ourselves, that we can interact with. So someone with this worldview would suggest that communicating with spiritual entities comes with some degree of difficulty, since they exist on a plane that in some ways intersects our plane, but is nevertheless distinct from our plane. And so from that perspective, these entities must be somehow coaxed. Depending on the practitioner, that might mean either threatened or enticed, so that they might be willing to make the effort to cross over to our material plane of existence to communicate with you. I'll just make a little addendum here for any novice listening in to say that just in the same way as you don't need to travel to a distant country to communicate with your pen friend, in the same way spirits are quite capable of acting upon your requests without needing to appear in person, in a visible form, in your presence. But that's for another video. There are a great many very well-respected practitioners in the occult field who hold this view. In fact, I'd say the majority of the most vocal practitioners with the highest visibility in the scene, so the modern superstar occultists, if you like, they seem to hold this view. And they are of the opinion that spirits have a keen sense of smell. Now, as I warned you, this may sound surprising to many people for many different reasons. However, this has a biblical grounding. The deluge, or the great flood that was recorded in the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, was, as you know, also reported in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, as a part of the account of the life of Noah. Now, after the whole global destruction episode, in Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, we can read the following lines. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelt the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. So we're not even talking about a spiritus loci or a demon or an angel here, or the divine member of a pantheon. We're talking about the Hebrew supreme divinity, who clearly really likes the smell of a good barbecue, according to scripture, of course. Most of the classical grimoires give instructions on which incense, which aroma, which perfume to bring to the ritual, depending on the spirit being evoked. I say most classical grimoires just to be safe, but I don't personally know of any that don't mention aromas. And yes, the theory is that certain spirits particularly like certain smells, and they're more likely to turn up if the environment into which they're being called is made welcoming and actually appealing to them with their favorite scent, in the same way as some fancy furniture shops and clothes shops pump various exotic and luxurious aromas into the air to lure customers in and make them believe that the shop's exorbitant prices are somehow not unreasonable. Now, these same superstar practitioners I was talking about, they also suggest that this is the reason for ritual bathing, as body odor, no matter how faint, is supposedly repulsive to certain spirits. And the same for shaving hair, which is particularly prone to spreading the odour of the human body. If the theory is correct, I wonder how necessary shaving hair would still be since the invention of shampoo, but I suppose that's another video too. Some supporters of this theory also suggest that the upward direction of the smoke somehow carries messages or prayers to the spiritual realms. But now we're really entering the realm of superstition and a model where spirits literally live in the upper layers of the planet's atmosphere and beyond. Alright, so then there's the psychological model. Not the idealist model, mind you, I'll talk about that in a bit. The psychological model is still a realist model in that it assumes that consciousness is something that arises out of matter, that brains actually generate consciousness, which, let's be honest, is kind of the default assumption that most people believe before they spend any significant amount of time thinking about it. So the psychological model assumes that everything is just some kind of placebo effect, that in fact the practitioner is really, in quotes, only communicating with parts of his or her psyche. Many people from the previously discussed model would argue that this model is inconsistent with their own experiences of encounters with physically manifested spirits. Be that as it may, this is a model that became very popular in the second half of the 20th century with the rise of, I'll say, armchair psychologists who believed that they understood the works of Carl Jung, but had missed the point that he didn't subscribe to the realist worldview at all. So for this group, the thing that's really happening is that our unconscious mind is responding to certain stimuli, with the response that it brings up certain personal archetypes for us to interact with. And the sense of smell just happens to be the sense that has the most powerful effect on the unconscious. Which isn't all that silly, actually, when you think about how a smell can take you instantly back to a time in your life that you'd maybe even forgotten about, much more effectively, immediately, and involuntarily than, say, a sight or a sound or the feel of a texture. Alright, so my pretty weak attempt at presenting these worldviews in an unbiased way is clearly failing, so let me finally give you the view that I personally share, and of course the fact that I share it doesn't make it accurate, it just makes it the view of one guy on the internet, who found it to be the most consistent with his small range of experiences. When Lon-Milo Duquette wrote in his fantastic book, Low Magic, the quotation that he's probably best known for today, namely, "It's all in your head, you just have no idea how big your head is." The assumption made by most realists was that he was supporting the second theory that I just mentioned, the psychological model. But that's not the case at all. Lon subscribes to the actual Jungian theory that the prima materia, the material from which everything is ultimately built, is consciousness. Consciousness itself is what matter is made of, that matter exists within consciousness, not the other way around. And so, consequently, when we call an entity, it is indeed an aspect of ourselves that turns up, but not of our small local selves with which we identify most of the time, but rather of our big selves, or higher selves as some practitioners put it. And you can check out my video on the shamelessly ripped off vast mind process, linked in the description if you're not sure what I mean here. So when it comes to me, my tentative theory is that there may be something about the hypnotically slow movements of the smoke that give your local conscious mind something transfixing with which to occupy itself, while higher or maybe deeper levels of your mind are being made manifest. Who knows? Ultimately, whether we subscribe to the realist or the idealist worldview, we use perfumes and burnt herbs and incense, well, because it works. And since it's only really possible to speculate about the actual reasons why it works, well, maybe we should spend that energy on other things. Like, for example, actually making scented offerings. Alright, so now here's the practical part of the video that you've been waiting for. How do you go ahead and use perfumes and incenses in your own practice? Of course you don't have to. But as I said earlier, many people find it to be one of the most effective ways of being successful in their evocations. So I think the first step I'll relate to you here is to have a nice stock of frankincense. Different spirits tend to like different fragrances, and what's going to smell irresistible to one is going to be utterly repulsive to another. But frankincense seems to be generally common ground. There are a few demons that don't like it, but actually many demons really love it. And my guess is that if you're working with demons, you're probably already working from a book or a grimoire that lists their individual smell preferences. But if you're working mainly with, let's say, right-hand path and celestial entities, you really can't go wrong with frankincense, whether it's planetary spirits or household deities or gods of any given pantheon or angels or a monotheistic point of focus. They all love frankincense. And you can then find out what they individually like even more once you've successfully established a communication channel with them. Frankincense is called olibanum in many countries. I hope that ends up being of some use to some of you. Another tip is to pick up an occult encyclopedia type book like Dr. Skinner's Complete Magician's Tables. And I know I complain about that book and its horrible table of contents and even worse index and occasional listing error. Man, I'm really selling it, aren't I? But it still remains the most complete compilation of correspondences to date, especially with regards to individual spirits and what they specifically like and what they don't like. From times of day to directions in which to call them, to the kinds of smells they like. When you compare it to some of the nonsense you can find online, it's probably worth putting up with a few imperfections. Another great table of correspondences is The Key of It All, which is a double volume by David Allen Hulse, which I've also reviewed in the past. Very extensive, much easier to consult, but just not as focused specifically on Solomonic magic as Dr. Skinner's book is. Okay, my next tip is to know what you're getting into if you decide to invest in a proper incense burner, a censer or a thurible, where you get a little disc of charcoal and get that smouldering, and then you throw little crystals of incense resin onto it. And it creates this really rich, thick smoke that smells divine, sure, but very strong, and it can get really overpowering. So if you're practicing in a little flat with neighbors very close or even not so close, do know that you're essentially doing what priests do in gigantic cathedrals where the smoke still fills the space and can make your eyes water. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that a little can go a long way, and an incense stick, which is actually designed for small spaces, might have a slightly different smell, but it can be just as effective. Okay, finally I'll say that the scent that you're offering up doesn't have to be in the form of smoke. Vapor works very well too, and you can get really nice oil burners, very simple ones, which just heat up water from underneath. But also really fancy ones that create visible, thick, white vapors too. But even vapors aren't absolutely necessary. I occasionally like to put out a little dish of Cointreau, which is a liqueur with a strong smell of oranges, for Mercury, especially during the planet's retrograde movements, just as a token of support. And if I'm honest, mainly so my parcels don't go missing. But anyway, just because the scent of the alcohol doesn't flood the room in beautiful great plumes of white smoke, doesn't make the offering ineffective. Now, what about you? Do you use incense in your own practice? Are there any tips you can share with other viewers? You can leave your comments down below, of course, or if you're interested in chatting in a bit more depth about these kinds of topics, you might like to consider becoming a Foolish Fish member for as little as $2 a month to get access to the Foolish Fish Discord chat server. And you can find all the details and instructions on how to do all of that down in the description. Now, if you did enjoy the video, but you feel that membership isn't quite for you yet, then another thing you can do to help out the channel is just to click on the like button, and of course, to hit that subscribe button and the little bell button if you haven't done so already. The bell button is basically so that you actually get to see my newly released videos on your YouTube homepage when I put them online. Otherwise, they just get buried under YouTube's suggested videos, so you never actually get to see the videos from your subscribed channels. They're funny like that, at the time of recording anyway. Alright, well, that's all I have for you this week, folks. Thank you as always to all you incredible members who keep the channel alive and who put food on my table and books on my shelf, which in turn brings ideas into my life that I get to talk about here. I'll really never be able to thank you enough. You really have no idea how much your support means to me. At the time of recording, we even have a Lux Aeterna level supporter, a level 4 supporter, which I really never expected to happen. So thank you ad aeternum, one spun honey. From me and from my family, your generosity really goes straight to our hearts. And thanks finally to you who made it to the very end of the video. I hope I've given you at least a little food for thought. Please take care of yourself and of each other, and see you very soon with another video.